Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and try to get started here today. So today we have a presentation by one of our NLM PhD students, Dana Womack. And Dana comes to us from a rather unique background in that she has acute clinical nursing background as well as high-tech background at Intel. She's worked on projects related to ONC, and she's going to be sharing with us her initial ideas about her dissertation on ambient data, a new source of insight. So I'll turn it over to Dana. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eden. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. It just means a lot that you're here to participate in my symposium. So my goals for today are to share my research interests, to identify a gap that I'd like to address in my dissertation research, and to enlist your ideas and suggestions, because the next thing is the dissertation proposal, which is very much a work in progress, and your feedback will only make it stronger. By way of topics, I'd like to introduce the opportunity space that I'm going after, a bit about my personal motivation. We'll go through a review of literature on some workforce and patient safety related topics, and then we'll delve a bit deeper into the research gap that I want to address and look at some exploratory work that was done over the summer and end with next steps. So the opportunity space that I'm really excited about is this intersection of patient safety, the work experience of clinicians, and extracting value from all available data. I feel like these three circles are highly complementary, and at the center there's some space for some really interesting interdisciplinary research, and that we can bring informatics to the table to really move the bar on both patient safety and clinicians' work experience at the same time. So why do I care about this topic? I'll start with an anecdotal story. I started out my career as an orthopedics and neurosurgery nurse at a community hospital in rural Indiana. I come to work one day, one of my patients is going to a nursing home. She had fallen, broken her hip, and needed a little more rehab. And so shortly after change of shift report, the ambulance showed up to take her, transfer her to the facility. And I realized I need to quickly go to the chart, make sure everything was in order. And as I was looking at the chart, I realized, oh no, she had not yet had her PPD placed, nor her chest x-ray, which is a mandatory thing to screen for tuberculosis before a nursing home would ever accept her. So I had to run down the hall, tell the ambulance guy, sorry, got to take her off the gurney, explain to the patient what was going on, fire off stat orders to pharmacy and radiology. And meanwhile, other patients are having to wait. Who knows what the impact was to patients on other units, as radiology was attending to my need rather than theirs. And I just felt like I was setting fires all around me, and it was completely wasted and unnecessary energy. And this story played itself out day after day, variations on the story. Sometimes the outcomes were relatively small, like a delayed discharge. Sometimes they were larger. Sometimes it was like, oh my God, I'm so glad we caught this, or that could have been really bad. So I went to talk to my nurse manager about it, and I said, you know, every day I feel like there's these things that happen that are largely out of my control. I went into nursing to provide excellent care, and I feel like there's compromises, and I can't always do anything about them. And this is really frustrating to me as a nurse. And I'll never forget what she said, because it was a pivotal comment that has really shaped the direction of my career. And she said, Dana, we just need more conscientious nurses like you. And it was really one of the most disheartening compliments I've ever received, because here's what I heard is, it's going to be the same tomorrow. I'm not enlisting you in helping to solve this problem, and I don't see this as a system issue, because the solution to safe and effective care is to have conscientious clinicians. Now, I have no argument. You need conscientious clinicians, but my perspective is that you need conscientious clinicians working in a system that's designed to help them deliver safe care. So from that moment forward, I started plotting my exit from this rural hospital in Indiana, because I knew it had to be better in the big city. I just needed to get there. So a friend of mine and I signed up as traveling nurses, and we started crisscrossing the nation, and we would take 8 to 13-week assignments in large and small hospitals. And what we found is that, unfortunately, this is a universal challenge that clinicians and patients face in hospitals all over the US. And in fact, some of the places where we worked, because there's often reasons why people or hospitals will go to the extra expense of bringing in contract labor, is that there are environments that were actually much worse and more dangerous than our original hospital in Indiana. So then I started plotting a change in my role, because working as a nurse in the status quo organization was just unacceptable to me. I'd heard about informatics, and so in 2000 I finished a master's degree in nursing informatics at the University of Utah and switched into industry because I was really fascinated with this idea of eliciting end user needs and translating them into functional requirements for new software solutions. So I worked in product development and in software implementation, again crisscrossing the nation. The red dots here represent places where I've worked clinically, and the green dots are places where I implemented software. And loved my stint in industry. It was fabulous, and I learned a lot, but I never felt like I was really directly addressing the issues that prompted me to go into informatics in the first place. So here I am in 2016, extending my skill set and doubling down on those original motivations. So let's talk for a minute about the hospital environment. It's a fascinating place. You have really dedicated staff working with really sick patients in a fast-paced, dynamic environment. And you've got really interesting, each patient is kind of an interesting collection of building blocks. You've got evidence-based guidelines that tell you, how you're going to work up a patient, how you're going to treat a patient, clinical pathways, what you should expect on post-op day 1, post-op day 2, hundreds of policies and procedures, and each of these has an evidence base, or most of them are evidence-based. And each patient has a different collection of these building blocks. And so we spend a lot of effort making sure that all of the building blocks have a good evidence base, but we have much less of an evidence base about knowing what happens when you select different building blocks that are applicable to this patient. And then you have this collection of patients that are all taken care of by a subset of clinicians at the point of care. So I think Gray and Kerfoot put it very beautifully when they said there's a need to grow an evidence base for effective hospital leadership practices and care delivery practices in clinical care environments that are often characterized by chaos, turbulence, and complexity. And nothing would make me happier than if my research could help contribute to that growing evidence base. So let's take a short look at what we know in the literature, first looking at workforce issues. There are cyclical shortages in nursing and in other professions. And in 2009, there was a survey done of nurses, and nurses overwhelmingly said that the single thing that you could do to help relieve the nursing shortage was to improve the work environment, which really suggests that nurses are making choices about where they work based on the characteristics of the care environment. And it's not just nurses. If we jump forward to 2016, physician burnout is becoming a really important topic to look at. Last year, the Physician Foundation survey found that nearly half of physicians experience feelings of burnout on a frequent or continual basis. And nearly half of the physicians surveyed said that they plan to either retire, cut back on their hours, or seek non-clinical roles. So just think about what that's going to do for the work environment of the clinicians that stay there and what that might do for access to care. Multitasking is another aspect that I'm highlighting because it affects both patient safety and the work experience of clinicians. And through observational studies, we know that hospitalists spend about 16% of their time multitasking. For nurses, it's a little more, at about a third of their time, and they're interrupted as frequently as every 6 minutes, which leads to a challenging work environment from both a work experience and a patient safety perspective. Patient safety has been an important focus for at least 150 years, probably more than that. But the first study that I'm citing here is Dr. Semmelweis, who is a very observant physician. And he noticed that when physicians examined cadavers, didn't wash their hands, and then delivered babies, that often these women would get sick with what they called childbed fever at the time, because the germ theory wasn't even really yet known in 1860. And this was kind of a radical idea at the time. But it was one of the early recognitions that seeking health care can actually result in harm to the patient. In the 60s and 70s, there were studies on length of stay, errors of writing in prescriptions. In the early 90s, there was a very large Harvard medical practice study where they looked at thousands of hospitalizations and found that a lot of them contained adverse events. Many of them were preventable or related to negligence. And this study was then replicated And together, those two studies formed the basis for the numbers that were used in that landmark 1999 IOM report to err as human, where they estimated that 44 to 98,000 deaths occur unnecessarily related to patient harm. This report launched a whole bunch of efforts in patient safety. A report a couple years later from the IOM looked at the Quality Chasm report, looked at systems and the role of systems in supporting safe and effective care. And many interventions ensued. The one that I'm highlighting, both because it was effective and also because it illustrates the point that interventions to move the dial in patient safety don't need to be elaborate. Very simple things like checklists for making sure that you're following correct procedure when you change a dressing on a central line can dramatically reduce the infections that patients experience. And then in 2015, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement looked back and they were like, well, where have we come? And like, what happened in the time ensuing from the IOM report? And their overall conclusion is that, yes, we've made progress, especially in the area of hospital-acquired infections, but there's a lot of work left to be done, and we need like this sustained and holistic focus on patient safety. It's not the new and sexy topic anymore, but it's nonetheless needed. So bringing it closer to home, let's look at some examples of what informatics has done to help patient safety. Clinical decision support has been a big focus in informatics, in antibiotic prescribing, drug-drug interactions, drug allergy, many other clinical topics. Human factors has been embraced both by informatics and by the medical community as a whole. It's like the user interfaces, the way our work is constructed, it definitely has an impact, and we need to look at these things in parallel with things like more evidence-based paradigms, or evidence-based medicine paradigms. Structured data is a staple in informatics, and an example there is there has been a classification system developed so that we can study all of the errors that were related to use of the electronic health record or other clinical electronic devices. And then here at OHSU, our own Dr. Ash and others created the SAFER guides, which are self-assessments that organizations can execute to optimize the safety and use of their EHRs. Excuse me. So let's take a quick look, a deeper look at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement Safety Recs from 2015, where they said, you know, where have we come in 15 years, and now where should we go from here? And on the left, we have a lot of more very good but more general recommendations, and on the right, I've highlighted 3 recommendations that really relate to the opportunity space I've identified and to informatics. The first is to create a common set of safety metrics that reflect meaningful outcomes and proactively identify risks and hazards. Second is to support the workforce so that clinicians can achieve their full potential as healers. And the third is to ensure that technology is safe and optimized to support safe patient care. A leader in safety in many different industries, including healthcare, is James Reason. And he's identified that safety and adverse events really have 2 primary sources. The first is active failures, which are like, you know, humans actually slips and lapses and things like that. And the other is latent conditions. These are more error-prone conditions in the workplace. And I love his quote, "We can't change the human condition," suggesting that you're not going to be able to ever eradicate all active failures, but we can change the conditions in which humans work. So suggesting that focusing on latent errors is really where you want to go if you want to get more proactive in managing safety. So where are we right now, and what do we do in terms of measuring patient safety? If you look out at the ARC patient safety metrics, most of them start out with the word rate of X, rate of retained surgical items, rate of infections related to a central line catheter, rate of pressure ulcers. And so you've already had an event that's occurred, and you're measuring how frequently does that occur, and then you're benchmarking yourself against other organizations, which is an important thing to do. Another focus that we have along this lines is once an event has occurred to conduct a root cause analysis to really understand how and why and contributing factors to that event. But if you want to, in the spirit of the IHI recommendations, move upstream to a more proactive focus on patient safety, you're going to have to start looking at latent conditions. which begs the question, how do you identify what latent conditions in the healthcare environment contribute to adverse events? So this suggests that you need the ability to estimate risk in real time. But to do that, you're going to need to know a little bit about what are these error-provoking conditions. And to identify those, you're going to need more granular and detailed information about what's going on in your healthcare environments. So the research gap that I'd like to address is really the development of methods to identify what are the latent error-producing characteristics that exist in patient care environments. How can we recognize them? How can we identify what they are? And is it possible to start looking at these in real time so that we can take proactive interventions when these conditions are known to be present, and so that we can prevent adverse events? So this leads me to the idea of ambient data. Ambient data is really data that's produced as a byproduct of care by devices that were meant primarily to support logistical functions. So you have medication systems. The primary purpose there is getting meds to the nurse who gets them to the patient. Communication devices, supporting communication between staff and other departments. The nurse call button is, how patients identify that they need somebody to come to their room to help them. And so the primary purpose is really to facilitate the logistical aspects of care execution. But behind all of these systems, you have like log files that have little records of all of these events that occur. And currently, these are siloed, and they're not typically analyzed even in a system-by-system way, but definitely not in aggregate. So to just kind of give you a visual of how ambient data works, you can think of, this is a typical patient hallway, and you have these little digital footprints of activity that are taking place behind every door, in every med room, and in the hallways. And from a superficial level, if you were just looking at a snapshot in time, you could see, what activity is taking place. But you can also start to infer a deeper meaning from this. Like, for example, if you dispense D50 or dextrose 50% on a med-surg unit, really the only reason you do that is when a diabetic crashed and you need to elevate their blood sugar really quickly. And so you know that a nurse is going to be busy recovering a patient, a physician is going to be paged, you might need a bed in the ICU, and you can start thinking about how you can develop deeper knowledge just from the knowledge of activities that are taking place at the bedside. So I really want to help healthcare organizations get value out of their ambient data, but I knew that it was too much of a leap to go from just this idea to writing a dissertation proposal, because what happens if people aren't willing to give you access to the data, or what happens if it's in such a format that you really can't analyze it? So over this past summer, through the help of many people, some of you are here in the audience today, I was able to gain IRB approval and access to ambient data from the hospital for a post-surgical unit here at OHSU. I had data from 5 electronic systems that were operational systems, and 2 that were more focused on outcomes, the safety events and overtime. And this resulted in over 40,000 date time-stamped events. If you do the math for a month, that's about 1 per minute. And the ambient data that I pulled is a fraction of the ambient data that exists. So it kind of gives you an idea of the level of transparency of activity that might be able to be achieved through looking at ambient data. So what did we learn? It seems that ambient data, the top graph is basically just a look at the volume of activity over time. And you can see that these are the hours of the day, and it's a month's worth of data. So you can see that activity ramps up at 7, stays fairly consistent through the day, and then starts to drop off in late evening and the wee hours in the morning. Here on the second graph, this is looking at medications, and you can see a strong temporal pattern where there's a lot of medications that are given at our twice a day BID med times, but that medications are also delivered at all hours of the day. This view is, we have our nurses on the left, and then each nurse is caring for multiple patients, and we have just basically counts, this is activity count across the bottom, of the activity that they're conducting through the day based on what we had access to. You can see there wasn't a lot of variability in how many times they went in and out of the med room, the blue dots, but there is variability in like how many meds they actually dispensed to their group of patients, how many times they communicated with each other, which are the green squares, and how many times their patients summoned them to the bedside, which are the orange squares. And when I started showing this to the nurse manager and clinicians on the unit, they were like, wow, this would be really great because it could help us start to identify if there's equitability and parity in our patient loads and help us understand really what's going on for the unit. But in order to help really do patient assignments, you kind of need this at a patient level as well. So we made this visualization where we have our nurses, our superheroes, I'm using pseudonyms, at the top, and then our patients in columns. And you could certainly add numbers to represent different aspects. This is really looking at volume of activity. And so from a patient assignment perspective, you just want to make sure that you're not having all the big dots under the same nurse column. So here, this data suggests that we have Iron Man taking care of Corky, who's taking a lot of PRN meds, and Wonder Woman has a patient who's using the call light a lot. Batgirl is kind of evened out, and Supergirl has some people taking scheduled and PRN meds. And so again, these are just 3 sources of data that I had. They haven't been combined in any sort of more sophisticated way they could be. We talked with the nurses about, wouldn't it be great if we could create a summary measure that kind of was like weighted in some way so that you're not having multiple bubbles. But obviously, we need to first understand what's driving activity, what's driving workload. Here's another view looking at medications. And in this view, we have our RNs on the left. We have our patients across the top. The size of the square represents the volume of meds that a patient's receiving, and the color, the depth in color, represents how many of those are PRN meds. PRN meds are really interesting because they represent that you're actively managing something with the patient. They're in pain, they have nausea, they are having difficulty breathing, so something's happening physiologically with them that's also being reflected in activity that's taking place on the unit. And so we, kind of brainstormed ways that this might give you insight into both patient assignment as well as how patients are doing. But an idea that came was like, well, could we use this to kind of show patient trajectories and how are they doing over time, and how might we use ambient data to do that? So this visualization looks at, we have the days of the month across the top, our patients across the left, and this is summarizing their medication intake during their hospitalization. And what you notice here is that patients tend to have, they start out with like more medications and then it decreases, which kind of makes sense on a post-surgical floor. You're decreasing your PRN meds before they're ready for self-care and home. We have one patient here who was quiet here quite a long time, variable use of meds. And then this patient here is kind of interesting because it was like, started like ramping up towards the end. Now, I didn't have diagnosis or disposition data, so I don't know what actually happened to that patient, but it makes you just start thinking about ways that you might be able to use this data. Was she a bounce back to the ICU? Did she go home like that? And was she at high risk for readmission? You could start thinking about ways that you might look at patient trajectories and patterns of patient trajectories in relationship to an outcome that you really care about. And then the last example of how we might be able to use this data is to overlay activities of interest. So here we have a staff nurse call. This is July 4, was issued in the mid-afternoon. And here, this is the beginning on night shift. Very unusual to have 3 RNs have 45 minutes of overtime on the same shift. Something obviously went down. And I'm not suggesting that we can learn anything just by looking at the activity patterns, which are in the background here, because this is just a very small n. But if we started looking at identifying patterns of activity and then looking at when are those overtimes, when are those med errors, we might be able to really start identifying the activity that relates to an outcome of interest. There are quite a few challenges in working with ambient data. First of all, the data doesn't hang together very well. some of the systems, this data wasn't designed for analysis or visualization. It's basically just a record. And whoever designed the systems just designed log files that if you had a need, you could go back and see what happened. And so there are systems that know just about the staff person, and other systems know just about the patient. Or maybe they know just about the room number, but not the patient name. And so you have to start, and even when you know about the staff in two different data sources, for example, the way staff are identified in Vocera, the communication device, is a different identifier than is used in Omnicell, which is the medication dispensing device. And so, for good reasons. It had to do with a technical limitation of an interface device. But now, so if you had a need for your Vocera to be interfaced with the nurse call, they used your cafeteria ID in Vocera. Otherwise, they use your employee ID. And so now all of a sudden, you need a crosswalk between the burrito codes and the ID codes in order to get all this data to hang together. So those are definitely things that need to be worked through and ironed out. And this one might be interesting in that you'd be surprised at how difficult it is to identify which nurse took care of which patients. This is truly, I've recreated it using the pseudonyms, but this is exactly what they're using for a nurse-patient assignment on the study unit that I pulled data from over the summer, where you have a list of your staff names and the shift, and then you handwrite in the bed number and the patient name. And these are scanned into PDF files, and those become the official record of who had whom. So we're like, okay, we have a great electronic record system here. Like, there's got to be a way. And we found out, you know what, there's 3 ways in our EHR that you can identify yourself as taking care of a patient, but none of them are used consistently. And so, it leads you to questions of, if you really want to analyze this ambient data, what I did is I manually hung it all together by looking at the names, and I created a clean data set to create the visualizations as an example. But we're going to have to overcome this if we want to create it into a live system. And one way is you could look at other systems where you're assigned in the Vocera call system so that you get calls from the right bed numbers, or you might infer it based on the nurse who's most frequently giving meds to a patient, are some ideas that have come up. But what are next steps? So everybody needs a big, hairy, audacious goal. And mine would be this, that we start aggregating data, ambient data from multiple hospitals, and create basically a learning system that helps identify what are the latent safety conditions that we need to start monitoring. And this could happen, we could even grow this further so that it would be hospitals in multiple countries, and that this would contribute to an evidence base of effective care delivery. But on a more practical level, what are the steps? I mean, how could we start taking steps toward that vision? And one more thing, though, is that back to that vision, I think it could be really interesting because this data, in a way, is a lot less sensitive. We have visions of having a learning health system where we're sharing electronic health record in a very, nationwide or international way. But, just sharing data about how many times a call out was pushed or how many meds were dispensed or the percentage of meds that were PRN meds is a lot less sensitive than sharing somebody's clinical data. So it could be possible that this could even serve as, if we were successful, it could serve as kind of a template or help people gain a vision for what could be done with even a richer data source. Okay, so back to our key steps. The first thing is to really develop the capability to listen to this data. You've got to be able to hear when it's happening, aggregate it in real time. And then after that, you have to normalize it. Even the way dates and times are represented in this data is not the same. Maybe you have the date in one column, the time in another column. Or you have a single date timestamp, and in one it's measured at the second level and another at the sub-second level. And so you've got some normalization of identifiers, terms, scales that needs to occur. Then we can get to the part where it gets a little more interesting and we can start analyzing this data. What are features? What are patterns in this data, and how do they relate to things of interest like clinical trajectories or workloads or medication errors or overtime or any of these outcomes of interest? And then ultimately, this is where we have more and more value. We have increasing data manipulation and more value to the users when we can actually give them actionable information. It's like, right now, you're at risk for X, and here's what you can do to reduce your risk of that. So where are we right now? In order to do the research that we're envisioning, we really need a couple of things. We need near real-time access to the data so that we can create visualizations and introduce it to the patient care units so that they can start understanding and learning when the unit is like, feels like safety is compromised, what metrics are high. And then after you learn that, you can start combining those metrics in a more intelligent way. So over time, you can grow the value and sophistication of these proactive safety metrics over time. And then if you want to start looking at like what patterns are associated with medication errors or that sort of thing, you need kind of a longitudinal record that you can go back and look at. And so the goal right now is to create initially the flow of data and then real-time visualizations and an archive to support research. And OHSU has purchased a software, Splunk, that is designed to read machine data, and it's used in ITG right now. And it's kind of a happy accident where they're looking for more clinical use cases for use of this software. And so Tim, who thank you for being here, is working with me in ITG, and we're actively meeting with our source system owners to get permission to get the forwarders in place to create the data stream that we need for research. So what are the research questions that we might ask? This is the next step where I really need to hone in on just several of them and do a deep dive. But I see the research questions really spanning 4 categories. This data, I believe, can help us improve situational awareness. It can help us generate questions about our clinical practice. It can, hopefully, help us develop proactive safety metrics by identifying these latent conditions in the workplace environment. And ultimately, through the collections of the metrics and situational awareness, help us achieve more data-driven operations. These questions were partially, they're based on my interactions with the clinicians over the summer. And some of the questions that came through were like, how can I use this data? I think it might be able to help me, help my charge nurses know when to ask for help. There's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that, and there's a variability in terms of people's thresholds of feeling when they know when we really need to go ask the house for additional resources. Another question was, how might it change the way we make patient assignments? There was a lot of, it was kind of exciting to see clinicians start to look at the ambient data, which they've never seen before, and it started prompting questions like, how come do we use a lot of that supply at this hour of the day? I really don't understand that. It makes me want to go and learn this. And so just access to this data will trigger a lot of questions about clinical practice. And then in the situational bucket, it's really one of the nurse managers really wanted to help understand what drives errors. One unit, they hadn't had a fall in days and days and days, and then one happened. And it's like, why was it? Was the nurse, was there a different activity level? Like, how can we start learning what's putting us at risk for different adverse patient events? So to get to where we are with the idea, at this point in time, I have many, many people to thank. People at OHSU Hospital who provided access, Dr. Eldridge and others who really helped open doors to gain access to data, and my faculty advisors here at DMICE, the ITG, and many other people who were at the technical level of contributing data. And then I even need to thank the guys at Splunk, because I didn't know about the need to use Splunk for clinical use cases, and it was actually them that provided the introduction to Amar and Tim. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions and discussions. And thank you for the reminder. If you just please push the button so that everybody out on the web can hear the questions as well.
So this is a big open space, lots of new data. That's always very exciting, especially stuff that we think is associated with something but we don't actually know. What's the, in your mind, what's the low-hanging fruit, hypothesis research questions that you can ask of this? Because it's going to be a big task to get all this together and normalize it and all that, and just be able to look at it, right? But you can't really build a dissertation off of looking at it. You have to have some hypothesis you're testing. So what do you think is the most basic kind of core thing that you're likely to be able to get, interesting results from that isn't too grandiose yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I went out to the literature to look at, is anybody using this data yet? And I only found 2 studies, and one of them looked at frequency of taking vital signs. And it was an exploratory study, and their premise was that clinicians have kind of a sense of worry that grows about a patient. And one of the ways that that sense of worry is reflected is they take vital signs more frequently. And so in this exploratory study, they looked at the not the content, but simply the frequency of documenting vital signs in the 48 hours before somebody had a heart attack. And what they found was that there was more frequent vital signs taken in the 48 hours before a heart attack. And if you lived or died, the patients who passed had more vital signs taken than the patients who lived. And so it was an exploratory study. I met the author at AMIA, and it looks like they're going to get funded to take that a little bit further. So that's one example in current work. But to your question of low-hanging fruit, I think that if you look at med errors are fairly infrequent events, but that's definitely an area of interest. Right now with pharmacy, I'm exploring the barcode med administration data to see if perhaps we could look at when you started to give a med but backed out of it, and if that's a proxy measure for a potential med error, and could you look at activity patterns related to backing out of giving a med as basically latent conditions that are associated with near misses would be one. An outcome that's very easy to identify is overtime. That would be another one that I think would be low-hanging fruit and financially related. Absolutely, Dr. Nonis.
Light goes on.
I'd like to add something to that, or just a thought on that.
Thank you.
Is the frequency with which vitals are taken. We have a rapid response team at the hospital that can be deployed to patients who are deteriorating to either say, well, they need to go to an ICU, or to stabilize them. And it relies on somebody saying, hey, we need to call the rapid response team. This could be an early warning sign, and there is a group looking at early warning signs using data, not human interpretation of data. And if, for example, we find that the frequency of vital signs is a trigger for people who are deteriorating, that could be a flag to get the RRT team early. And because what we found is the earlier you get the rapid response team, the less people will die. Or they get to the ICU faster, which is the right thing for them.
Which triggers another thought that in the recent past, Dr. Nonis and I had a conversation about PRN meds and looking at the frequency of PRN meds. And her specialty is pulmonology. And what, a scenario that we were kind of theorizing about is like patients who are medicated for anxiety when it's really a pulmonary deterioration, and then it can get a little bit too far before you really realize what's going on with a patient. And maybe if we look at these increases in PRN use, that those might be associated with rapid response calls would be another idea, potentially a low-hanging fruit you could look at. Dr. Gorman.
Forgive me for putting the fruit out of reach, but one of the things that's most exciting to me about this work that you're doing is the potential to combine kinds of data that haven't been combinable before. Mm-hmm. So data about nursing and medications administration and all that is kind of the same universe. But data about going to X-ray, or when your meal arrived, or all the other stuff that collides with patient care. And so if we're trying to figure out why a med was late, or why something happened, or why the patient went in failure because they ate all that salt, I don't know, but the potential to combine stuff from completely different realms, which I think mystify me as I go through the hospital and wonder why things are bumping into each other all the time. That may extend the fruit out of reach, and yet I think there's great potential there.
Thank you.
I don't know if it necessarily extends out of reach, because you're already talking about, I don't know if we'll get to the analytes, but you're already talking about characterizing symptom representation. community, not who we can characterize as directors, to be able to identify differences between patterns, so that it's out the commonalities and distinctions, and see what about the administration side is different.
Thank you. That's an excellent suggestion. Isa?
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I mean, and and I'm interested in this kind of things we've talked about. But two questions. One is about what was just said, and one about the trajectory. So I'll go to the latter one first. The frequency of vitals, like if you're looking at a physician being concerned of a patient, and therefore the frequency in which he tests or she tests vitals for, isn't that confounded? Because he or she already has some, whatever they are, cognitively some features that gives the concern. And you're looking at a confounded feature, which is their concern, and the frequency by which they send the vitals. So that's just a thought, and which I would like you maybe to answer or not. But the other one was the specific about what you showed was the patient trajectory. How would you think is best to put patients who have a different day zero, a different length, and a different end date to say, oh, look at their ends, they saw more meds, but their ends are different, their times are different, and there's lots of variation there.
I'll answer the second question first, because I think you're going to need to really figure out how to window looking at this data. Like, is it looking at a hospitalization? Are you looking at trajectory over a day, over 2 days, over a rolling number of hours? I think we're going to have to, identifying that unit of time measure and how we bucket that is going to be an important thing to figure out. To the first question, where is there some confounders around frequency of vital signs? I think it seems like that's a very valid concern. I think perhaps what we're looking for here are meaningful metrics that help you shape your actions in the clinical care environment, not always causal, like a causal cause and effect relationship. For example, like the frequency of vital signs, it's never going to be a causal relationship. Like how many times your vitals are taken doesn't cause your heart attack, but maybe the number of times that your vitals are taken may be an indicator that allows you to have visibility into the concern that's in a clinician's mind, that in a way that doesn't require extraction of data from the EHR, from just a simple device that's used at the bedside may give you awareness that, hey, we need to prioritize focus on this patient today in this shift. Does that answer your question?
Partially, yes, because I see you're looking at a system side. You're just looking at once something happens, let's say let's send this legal team on to see what happened. But I'm more concerned, like, if you're going to have a smart system one day in the future that the hospital that targets these patients and identifies them ahead of time, this is a patient of concern, the physician has some features in his or her head that he or she is using that determines that better than the frequency at which he or she sends the vitals.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Nunes.
So we were just talking about, actually, I think a large portion of the time the physician doesn't order the vitals different and may not even be aware that they're being checked more frequently. It's actually people at the bedside who are saying, this doesn't look quite right. And that's if you looked at what's ordered, it would be discordant with what's actually being done. And that's another thing that we can look at.
But she said concern, the physician has a concern.
Not necessarily the physician.
It's probably going to be more likely the staff nurse at the bedside.
Yeah.
And so the vitals will be ordered, every 8 hours or every 4 hours or maybe in the ICU every 2 hours. But that's not like a maximum amount of time. It's like you totally have flexibility at the bedside to do it as frequently as you need in order to pick up on a change in condition.
This kind of ties in with Klein's notion in Powers of Mind of, I think that was the book, when people know something's wrong but don't know what or why. And that thing that comes from expertise. So the expert nurse at the bedside, or could be an MA, that just says, this is funny, and takes vital. So there's something going on, and no one recognizes yet what it is, and it isn't until tomorrow. So it may or may not be someone's hypothesis. And if it is someone's hypothesis, we don't even know whose it is, and they don't know why they've got it. But this might enable you to tap into it.
And Sorry, one more thing on this, because I do work with the group that's studying these early warning signs. People undercall for help because they don't have a number. They're like, well, the blood pressure is lower than this, and that's what it says to call. And we actually encourage people, is if the staff is concerned or worried, you should call a rapid response. But people don't feel comfortable with that. And this would be a way to get that discomfort and hesitancy out of the system. Because what they found in large studies is that 8 to 16 hours before somebody codes or goes to an ICU, there's usually vital sign abnormality trends. But it's not until they reach some magic number that people suddenly say, aha, this is a problem. So what you're talking about is what you said at the beginning, which is making the system support us. So it's not just relying on humans to use our acumen, but the system is promoting, well, you should be calling, you know, ding.
Dr. Dorr.
So I hear a conversation that there's kind of two parts. This sort of highlights what Aaron was talking about. But there's one, you can use new data to do anomaly detection, which this data is sort of set up in some ways to do. Like what's something that's very unusual, you can look for patterns and find that. Or you could use the data to sort of describe systems and then predict sort of the next stage of the system or something to see, you know, and you've given a little bit of examples of both. I guess which of those is more interesting to you, and how might you differentiate between them, and how, maybe this is a sort of a broader PhD question, you're going to have a lot of problems with validation, especially as you integrate the data. Like the meaning behind the data is really not known, is sort of what you said. And how you get at that meaning for those two cases is very different, actually, in general. There's different emphases on both. So do you have a sense of how you might approach that?
Thanks for the question. The anomaly detection, it kind of forces you to put things in two buckets. Either you're normal or you're abnormal. And I guess my own personal thought is that for some things that may be a little, it may be difficult to understand what normal is, and normal may change over time. And so putting things in two buckets like that may be not quite as helpful as characterizing activity or characterizing what is the phenomena that you're studying. And if you can classify it into different levels and then look at how those things relate to an outcome of interest, I think that's where I would probably focus my attention rather than anomaly detection.
When you were, I guess, manually looking at the data, do you have a sense of two parts? One, to what extent these different sensor sources could be used to validate one another? And two, to what extent they can fill in gaps that the other one doesn't track?
That's a great question. Thank you, Nathan. I guess some of the richest data that I had more than one source for would be medication data, because you have, well, what I got was the Omnicell record of when it was dispensed from a device. And I got this very late in the game, so I haven't completely really looked in at the barcode med administration, but that's another way of like when was it scanned. And then there's a third record, which is when was it documented that it was given in the EHR. And so the way meds are given in the hospital, it's like you have a time when they're ordered, like say it's a 9 and 9 med. Typically there's like a range of time in which it's acceptable to give that med, usually maybe 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after, so you have an hour window. And nurses will dispense a med ahead of when they give it, a variable period of time, but they're not supposed to be carrying around meds that aren't labeled. And so that's, you know, one thing you could start looking at is like what the difference between like when they were dispensed and when they were given. But maybe more to your point of like how could you help validate is like what is the difference between the barcode administration time or the barcode scan time and the time that it was documented in the EHR. Those should really be pretty close together. And if you see discrepancies, it kind of makes you wonder, you know, is a nurse adjusting the time to make it look like she's compliant with a 30-minute time administration window, and would the barcode scan time actually be more accurate than the EHR documentation time? Absolutely.
Stephanie and I are having a blast up here. So what you just said reminded me of a concept from Lean called Murray rather. We mostly talk about Muda, which is waste, but Murray is unreasonableness. And it seems to me when, for example, when everyone's supposed to get their meds at 9, everyone can't get their meds at 9. And somehow it might be a clue to Murray that there's something wrong with our processes or our system that's putting people in an unreasonable situation that they're trying to figure a workaround to. It might not be they need more training. It might mean we need to create a system that doesn't ask someone to be in 40 places at 9 o'clock, for example. And Murray is this thing that's harder to get at, but most of us are familiar with the feeling of unreasonableness when the demands of the job are beyond what we can do.
I like that, and I really hope that this ambient data can lead and lend transparency to that and help us to rethink some of our really entrenched processes, like the 0900 med time or the 0700 shift change time, or that, it's like, think about changing those is like thinking about moving a small mountain. But obviously, if we want to look at patient safety, all of those processes should be on the table for potential change. Randy.
When lean comes up, I have to speak. So, so the other part of that is the MURA, which is the fluctuation, which causes overburden. So it sounds like there's a real opportunity to look at a system and how it fluctuates and what causes those fluctuations. So it's easy to, if you looked at nurses' time, for instance, that on the sum, they are not overburdened because they only have, on a 12-hour shift, 10 hours of work, for instance. But if you have 3 hours of work in a 2-hour window, that's caused by the system, which causes the overburden or unreasonableness. So it'd be really interesting on a macro level from a hospital as to how the whole system becomes overburdened and when, and what are the things that cause that. Is it everyone rounds at the same time? All those different things that we don't think about from a system standpoint, but ultimately it is all part of that. And I love the analogy of why are all these things running into one another when I'm walking through the hall? It's because we've caused them to happen. So from my perspective, there's all kinds of possibilities, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more about where those might work.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I look forward to brainstorming more about that. And as we hone in on a research question, it'll be interesting to look at like how many units, and I like the idea of kind of thinking about the hospital as a system too, like from how many places do we want to collect ambient data and start analyzing it. Yes?
So I have a couple of questions about bias. One from the direction of there's only so much data that you can get that's practical to actually get, but there might be lots of other kinds of ambient data, and you might be missing out on signals that should be there, and you might be biasing what you find just because you have this particular kind of data. Wow, this is so frequent, but that's only because you're measuring these signals, right?
Right.
So that's one side of possible bias. But then there's also possibly the other side of that. But so there's like what you're sampling from is really important to consider. So how do you decide about how to?
That's a really great point. Thank you for that. And I'll give an example. And I'll just kind of add to your point a little bit in that the workflow surrounding the ambient data has an effect on how you interpret it. For example, in nurse call, you have a bunch of timestamps. You have like when the call was first placed, when it was acknowledged, when it was escalated to another person, and then when it was finally canceled. And then you have a duration of like what was the duration of when that call was placed by the patient and when it was canceled or acknowledged. And if you're in a situation where staff working out on the hall are looking for the call light and they go into the patient's bedside and cancel it, that is the true duration of the time that the patient had to wait for somebody to answer. But on the unit that I observed, the post-surgical unit where I observed this summer, the process was that the patient would place the call light. It would also ring at the central console. The unit clerk would answer and say, hi, Mr. Jones, what do you need? Oh, I'm in pain. I need some more pain medication. Okay, I'll let your nurse know. Hang up the phone, which also canceled the call. And so basically it looked like that patient only waited, 5 or 10 seconds, when in reality, then the HUC would pick up the vocera and say, you know, Dana, your patient in 13 needs some pain meds, and maybe it took me 10 minutes to get, so the true time that that patient waited was 10 minutes. So there's a lot of things that we'll have to look at in how we actually interpret and make sure that we're not making assumptions about workflow that can look at the, you know, how you should interpret the data. And your point about like how many ambient data systems do you look at and are you missing something is totally valid. I guess my response to that is we have to start somewhere and keep growing and evolve the system over time.
So just to follow up, so say you were able to measure as much stuff as you wanted, and you had lots of systems in, and everything was sort of monitored. How would that affect, and even in the service that you observed already, how does being observed affect the behavior as you're going through? Because, for example, clinicians that I've talked to sometimes don't like the fact that every single thing they're doing is being measured and used for their evaluation.
That's a really great point and something that we need to be aware of and develop procedures to guard against, you know, like, and to be aware of if we are observing during the collection of ambient data. But at a you know, healthcare, it's a high-paced environment where you've got to just get your work done, and at some level you're just like getting your meds out and you're dispensing them when you dispense them, and kind of just the nature of it being out of an operational system, I think, is going to at some level reflect actual activity. But you know, good point. I mean, when I talked to nurses, it was interesting. Like they said, you know, I asked, you know, about medication dispensing practices, and they're like, yes, I always dispense for just one patient and then go to the bedside and come back and get meds. But I'm aware of other nurses who dispense for more than one. And then a lot of nurses said that same thing. So you know that that's a practice that's probably going on that people aren't, you know, openly ready to talk about. And that's a good point, because we're going to have to be thinking about how we can actually guard against potentially negative uses of this data that we may or may not anticipate before we go down this path.
We're running out of time, but I think Deborah has one last question, and then I think we'll need to wrap up. The question I had is about missed care.
Yes.
And one of the challenges with the electronic medical record is we'll put a box in, and so more checks can happen. We already know that nurses are spending somewhere between 35 and 45% of their time in the record, not with the patient. One of my concerns about looking at all the ambient data is what's not there and how to account for what isn't being done or documented, and how to think about that, which certainly influences the pace and volume of stuff.
Yes, excellent question. Thanks, Dr. Eldridge. I think I've thought a lot about missed care. The challenge I have is how do you know that it was missed, and what data can I look at to identify that it was missed? And the place I've looked to for that is like supply use, like certain, you know, like if you're changing a dressing, you're using certain supplies. The way that supplies are dispensed in the unit, one of Randy's ideas was looking at chlorhexidrine and you know, central line dressing changes, for example. It's an open bin that has a scale. And so basically the data that's recorded is your quantity on hand. And so it's reduced by 1 every time somebody uses something, but I don't know what patient it's used for. Now, in some other hospitals where I've worked, you basically dispense every single supply to an individual patient. So I know that a dressing change was, and so you could start to maybe look at some of those. If a supply is used, was the care missed? Was a central line dressing kit not, say it should have been done every 48 hours and it was 72 or longer before it was dispensed for the same patient, we could kind of start to infer that that care did not take place. But there's other things like patient turns every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. How do you really get at that? And so I'm very interested in the topic, but I'm a little short on data sources to help me know when care was missed.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Dana, there was a question that I had some time before. They wanted you to repeat the reference line.
The reference for the